The town of Pine River wore Christmas like a fine new coat. Fresh snow, white and deep, lay over the rooftops and fence posts, gleaming under the pale winter sun. Wreaths of pine and holly berries hung on every door, their cheerful red a bold splash against the wood and snow. From the chimney of the mercantile, the rich smell of cider and gingerbread drifted into the cold air, mixing with the sound of laughter and the distant, joyful chords of a carol being practiced in the little white church. It was a picture of perfect peace, a postcard of holiday warmth. But on the western edge of town, where the neat buildings gave way to the vast, rolling land of the Star Creek Ranch, the picture ended abruptly. The Star Creek Ranch was a kingdom of silence. No wreath hung on its heavy oak door. No candle glowed in its windows. The long lane leading to the sturdy log house was rutted with frozen tracks, untroubled by recent visitors. The only signs of life were the dark shapes of cattle in the distant pastures and the steady plume of gray smoke from the chimney, a signal not of festivity, but of mere survival against the cold. This was the domain of Caleb Mitchell, and in his domain Christmas was not welcome. Caleb stood at his barn door, a tall, broad-shouldered man of 40 whose face seemed carved from the same granite that edged the river. His eyes, a flinty gray, scanned the horizon not with hope, but with a stern vigilance. He watched the cheerful smoke of the town with a frown, the distant sounds of community grating against his soul like a rusty saw. 10 years. 10 long winters had passed since the heart had been cut out of his world. His bright young wife, Eleanor, and the tiny son he never got to hold, had been taken from him on a Christmas Eve blizzard, the midwife unable to reach them in time. In a single night, the music had died, the lights had gone out, and the God he'd once prayed to had felt as distant and cold as the stars. He had built a wall of work and solitude around his grief, and he let no one and no season breach it. Meanwhile in the town, a new kind of warmth had arrived. Her name was Juliana Rhodes. She had come on the last stagecoach before the deep snows, a young woman of 28 with eyes the color of warm cedar and a spirit that seemed untouched by the world's harshness. She was the new schoolteacher hired to educate Pine River's children in reading, sums, and though she didn't announce it, in kindness. She had known her own sorrows, a family lost to fever, a fiancé lost to a river, but where Caleb's losses had frozen him, Juliana's had deepened a quiet, resilient faith. She believed in a God of second chances, a God who could mend broken things. She saw Pine River with its festive spirit as a place to start anew. The schoolhouse was a small, bustling place, filled with the scratch of slates and the eager voices of children. Juliana quickly learned of their grand Christmas hope, to put on a living nativity pageant in the church with real sheep and a donkey, and to gather enough food and warm clothes to make baskets for the struggling families in the next valley. The children were full of ideas, but their faces fell when they mentioned the one thing they needed most. "We need a proper place to practice the pageant with the animals," said young Miles, a small boy with a serious face. "And Mr. Mitchell's big barn by the creek would be perfect. But he won't let us. He shouted at Tommy last year for just singing a carol near his fence," whispered a little girl. Juliana's heart ached for the children and sparked with a gentle determination. She inquired about Caleb Mitchell and heard the whispered story of his loss, spoken with pity and a shade of fear. The townsfolk had long since given up on the lonesome rancher. But Juliana, in her newness and her faith, felt a calling. It wasn't just about the barn. It was about the man in the silent house. She believed no one was beyond the reach of grace, not even a man who hated Christmas. And so, on a biting afternoon with the sky threatening more snow, Juliana wrapped her heaviest woolen cloak around her shoulders, placed a simple bonnet on her head, and set out on the long walk to Star Creek Ranch. She carried no weapon but a basket containing a loaf of freshly baked molasses bread and a heart full of courage. The festive sounds of Pine River faded behind her, replaced by the crunch of her boots on the icy path and the lonely sigh of the wind through the pines. As she approached the ranch, the silence became a physical presence. The house loomed, solid and unwelcoming. She walked up to the front door, took a deep breath that fogged in the air, and knocked firmly. The sound echoed hollowly. For a long moment there was nothing. Then the door swung inward and Caleb Mitchell filled the doorway. He was even more imposing up close. His gaze was not just unfriendly, it was a fortress wall. "What do you want?" His voice was low, gravelly from disuse. Juliana stood her ground, offering a small, polite smile. "Mr. Mitchell? I'm Juliana Rhodes, the new schoolteacher. I've come to—" "I know who you are," he interrupted, his eyes sweeping over her with a look that dismissed her as utterly insignificant. "If you're here about Christmas, you've wasted your walk. And your time. The children are hoping to practice their Christmas pageant, she pressed on, her voice calm but clear. They need a large, sheltered space for the animals. Your barn would be an answer to their prayers. We would be so grateful, and we would be in and out with no fuss. Caleb's jaw tightened. The word prayers seemed to hang in the cold air between them, irritating him. No, he said, the word final as a slamming gate. Mr. Mitchell, it would bring them such joy. Surely you could. Joy? He barked, the word exploding from him. The pain he kept locked away now flashed in his eyes, raw and dangerous. You speak to me of joy? You march up here with your smiles and your bread and your foolish pageant, thinking you can fix things that are broken? You know nothing. Nothing of loss, nothing of what this season truly takes. His anger was a blizzard, sudden and harsh. Juliana flinched but did not retreat. I think I may know more of loss than you suppose, sir. But I also know that shutting out the world doesn't heal the hurt. It only makes the winter colder. Her quiet words, spoken without fear, struck a nerve he didn't know was exposed. For a second, he looked almost stunned, then his expression hardened into something even colder. Your pretty words mean nothing on this land. My ranch is not a charity. My heart is not a project for a do-gooder schoolteacher. Take your Christmas and your faith and your molasses bread back to town where people want it. Stay away from me. Stay away from my pain. He stepped back and shut the door with a firm, definitive thud that echoed through the frozen yard. Juliana was left standing alone on the porch, the basket heavy in her hand, the rejection settling around her like the cold. She looked at the closed door, not with anger but with a profound, stirring pity. She saw now the depth of the frost that had encased his soul. It was worse than she imagined. But as she turned and began the long walk back to the lights of Pine River, her determination did not waver, it solidified. This was not just about a barn for a pageant anymore. A man was lost in a perpetual winter of his own making, and though he had yelled at her to go away, something in Juliana's spirit whispered that she was exactly where she was meant to be. The journey to melt a frozen heart had begun with a single brave knock on a door that had been closed for a very long time. The silence that followed Juliana's visit to Star Creek Ranch felt heavier than before, as if the very air around Caleb's home had thickened with his renewed resolve to remain untouched. 4 days, he threw himself into the most punishing work the winter ranch could offer. He mended miles of fence line with brutal, focused energy, his gloves growing stiff with frost. He chopped a mountain of firewood, the repetitive thwack of the axe a satisfying, angry rhythm that drowned out any softer thoughts. He forced his mind to be a blank ledger of tasks: feed the stock, check the ice on the troughs, inspect the roof, anything to stamp out the memory of the schoolteacher's clear, unafraid eyes and her infuriating, gentle pity. He told himself her words were just noises, that her faith was a child's fairy tale for those who hadn't seen real darkness. But at night, by the lonely fire, her question whispered back, does shutting out the world make the winter colder? He would bank the fire fiercely, answering the whisper with action, and retreat to a sleep haunted not by ghosts, but by a lingering, unfamiliar warmth in a stranger's gaze. In Pine River, life bubbled with festive energy. Juliana, true to her resilient nature, did not speak bitterly of her rejection. She simply helped the children pivot their plans, arranging to use the livery stable in town for their pageant practice, though it was cramped and smelled strongly of horses and old leather. She poured her heart into her students, into the careful stitching of costumes from donated fabric, into the practicing of hymns that now filled the schoolhouse. Yet, a part of her mind constantly traveled the snowy path west, to the silent ranch. She prayed for Caleb Mitchell not for the use of his barn, but for the peace of his soul. She began to learn more about him from the townsfolk, not just his tragedy but the man he was before. A fair dealer, a strong leader, a man known for his quiet generosity. This knowledge painted a picture of a soul worth saving, a heart that had once known how to love deeply and therefore perhaps could learn to love again. The catalyst for change arrived on the wings of a howling blizzard. It began innocently enough as fat, lazy flakes at midday, but by the time school was dismissed, the wind had risen to a furious shriek, hurling snow in blinding, horizontal sheets. Parents hurried to collect their children, their faces etched with concern. As the final student was bundled away, Juliana, peering through the frost-rimed window, felt a sudden, cold dread. Miles, the small, quiet boy, was not among them. He had mentioned that morning wanting to check on a neighbor's chicken coop door to ensure it was latched against foxes. His route home would have taken him near the edge of town, perilously close to the open, featureless fields that bordered Caleb's land. Panic, sharp and clear, cut through Juliana. She alerted the sheriff, but the men were already stretched thin, checking on outlying farms. Without a second thought, she wrapped herself in every layer she possessed and plunged into the storm. The wind stole her breath, the snow clawed at her face. She fought her way toward the last place Miles had been seen, her calls swallowed by the blizzard's roar. As the light began to fail, desperation turned her steps toward the only solid shelter she knew in that direction, the Star Creek Ranch. Caleb was in the barn, securing his own animals against the storm's fury, when he first heard the faint, desperate pounding on his front door. He dismissed it as the wind battering a loose shutter. But it came again, persistent. Irritated, he strode to the house and wrenched the door open, expecting a fallen branch. Instead, he found Juliana Rhodes, nearly unrecognizable under a crust of ice and snow, her cheeks whipped raw by the wind, her eyes wide with terror. "Mitchell. It's Miles Henderson, the boy. He's lost in the storm. He was last near the Northfield line. Please, you know this land. You have to help." Her words tumbled out in a frantic, frosty cloud. For a heartbeat, Caleb stood frozen not by the cold but by conflict. The old, hard part of him wanted to shut the door. This was not his problem. The town's child, the town's worry. Let them brave their own storm. But as he looked at Juliana, at the pure, unselfish fear for a child that overrode her own exhaustion and peril, the wall inside him developed its first hairline crack. He saw not the irritating do-gooder, but a woman of immense courage. And he remembered, with a sudden, painful clarity, what it felt like to care about someone that much. Wordlessly he turned, grabbing his heaviest buffalo coat, a coiled rope and a lantern. He thrust a thick horse blanket at Juliana. "Stay here. Keep the fire high." His command was gruff, but it was action. "I'm coming with you," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "You'll slow me down. You'll get lost. I know the direction he was headed. You know the land. Together we have a better chance." She met his glare, refusing to back down. A tense, silent battle passed between them in the swirling snow of the doorway. With a sharp, frustrated grunt, he yielded. "Keep up then. And don't you dare wander." The search was a nightmare journey. The world had been reduced to a white, screaming chaos. Caleb moved with an animal instinct, reading the lie of the land beneath the drifting snow, understanding the wind's direction. Juliana fought to keep his dark shape in view, her skirts dragging in the deep powder. He did not speak, conserving his energy, his entire being focused on the hunt. They called until their voices were hoarse, the wind mocking them with its endless howl. Just as a deep, chilling despair began to set in, Caleb held up a hand. He had seen a slight, unnatural depression near a cluster of rocks, a place where the wind might have scooped out a hollow. He plunged toward it, Juliana stumbling after. There, curled in a tiny frozen ball, was Miles. His lips were blue, his eyes closed. Caleb did not hesitate. He swept the small boy up, wrapping him in his own massive coat, rubbing life back into the tiny limbs. "He's alive," Caleb muttered, more to himself than to Juliana. The relief that flooded her was so powerful she nearly sank to her knees. The journey back to the ranch house was a brutal slog, Caleb carrying Miles like a precious, fragile burden, Juliana pushing herself beyond her limits to keep pace. When they finally burst into the warmth of the cabin, it was a sanctuary beyond price. Caleb laid Miles by the hearth, issuing quiet, competent orders to Juliana to fetch warm blankets and broth. Together they worked, a desperate, wordless team. As color slowly returned to the boy's cheeks and his eyelids fluttered open, a profound shared exhaustion settled over the adults. Later, with Miles sleeping peacefully wrapped in blankets by the fire, Juliana sat at Caleb's sturdy kitchen table, cradling a cup of hot tea he had wordlessly made. The storm still raged outside, sealing them in a quiet, charged world of their own. The anger and hostility that had filled this space days before was gone, replaced by the aftermath of shared peril and a quiet, dawning respect. "You saved his life," Juliana said softly, her eyes on the firelight dancing in Caleb's now softened gaze. Caleb looked at his rough hands. "I just know the land." "It was more than that," she insisted. "You came. You looked. You knew where to find him." She paused, choosing her words with care. "The man who did that tonight, that is the man the town remembers. That is the man God made you to be, Mr. Mitchell. Not the one who hides behind a fence." He did not argue. He could not. The memory of the boy's weight in his arms, the surge of protective purpose he had felt, had stirred something long dormant. He looked at her, truly looked at her, seeing the weariness, the kindness, the unwavering strength. He saw the woman who had braved a killer storm for a child, who had stood up to his rage without flinching, and who now sat in his kitchen, offering not criticism, but a recognition of his own forgotten goodness. "You should call me Caleb," he said finally, the words rough but deliberate. It was a small surrender, the first chip of ice falling from a glacier. The storm outside was beginning to wane, but inside the quiet ranch house, a different kind of thaw had just tentatively begun. The great blizzard passed, leaving Pine River buried under a deep, pristine blanket of snow that glittered under a sharp, clear sky. In the days that followed Miles's rescue, a subtle but profound change settled over the Star Creek Ranch. It was not a change of decoration or music, but a change in the very atmosphere. The silence remained, but it was no longer the heavy, defiant silence of a fortress under siege. It had become a quieter, more pensive stillness, as if the land itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Caleb Mitchell moved through his chores with the same efficiency, but the frantic, angry edge was gone from his work. His thoughts, which he had so rigorously disciplined for a decade, now wandered without his permission. They wandered to the determined set of a schoolteacher's chin as she faced his wrath, to the terrifying glimpse of her courage in the storm, and to the profound, quiet gratitude in her eyes as she'd sat at his table. He found himself doing strange things. One afternoon, he hitched his team and drove the heavy wagon into the high pasture to fetch a load of hay. On his way back, he passed the little white schoolhouse. He did not stop, but he slowed the horses to a walk. Through the window, he saw Juliana standing before her students, a book in her hand, her face animated with a passion for the story she was telling. The children were rapt, their faces turned toward her like flowers to the sun. Caleb watched for a long minute, a peculiar tightness in his chest. Before flicking the reins and moving on, the image burned into his mind. The next morning he rose before dawn. A task had needled at him. He had noticed on his rare trips past the schoolyard that the fence along the north side was in a sorry state, posts leaning, wires sagging, a danger to any child who might chase a ball. It was, he told himself firmly, a simple hazard. A liability. Anyone would fix it. In the gray pre-dawn light, he loaded tools and fresh lumber into his wagon and drove to the school. He worked in the cold, silent hour before the town awoke, the steady thump of his mallet and the scrape of his saw the only sounds. He replaced 3 rotten posts and tightened the wires until they sang in the frosty air. He was just packing his tools away, his breath making great plumes in the stillness, when the school door opened. Juliana stood there, wrapped in a shawl, her surprise softening into a smile that seemed to warm the entire frozen yard. "Mr. Mitchell," she said, the formality of the name now feeling like a shared, gentle joke between them. "Caleb." He straightened, suddenly feeling awkward like a boy caught doing a good deed. "Fence was falling down," he mumbled, not meeting her eyes. "Wouldn't want a child to get hurt." "It's more than that," she said, stepping closer. Her voice was soft, carrying in the clear air. "It's a kindness. Thank you." He dared a glance then. The morning sun, just clearing the pines, caught in her hair and lit her face. In that moment, she did not look at him with pity or with the fervor of a mission. She looked at him with simple, clear appreciation and something else, a spark of a connection that made the cold air feel suddenly charged. He felt a jolt, a thrilling, frightening warmth that started deep in his chest and spread outward. It was the first true, unbidden feeling of attraction he had allowed himself in 10 years, and it left him speechless. He merely gave a short nod, climbed onto his wagon and drove away. But he could feel her gaze on his back until he turned the corner, and the feeling stayed with him all day, a secret, glowing ember in the ashes of his heart. The town buzzed with preparations for the Christmas Eve service, the highlight of the season. The children practiced their pageant songs with renewed vigor, and the scent of baking pies and roasting meat filled every home. Caleb, in his quiet house, felt the pull of the festivities like a distant tide. The old instinct was to bar the door, to darken the windows, to wait for the day to pass. But the new, restless feeling would not let him rest. The memory of Juliana's smile by the fence warred with a decade of habit. On Christmas Eve, as the early winter darkness fell and the first stars pricked the violet sky, Caleb found himself standing before his small mirror, straightening his best shirt with clumsy hands. His heart hammered against his ribs, a traitorous drumbeat of fear and longing. He did not saddle his horse, choosing instead the anonymity of a walk. He moved through the snowy lanes like a shadow, approaching the little white church from the rear. The windows glowed golden, and the sound of 100 voices raised in "O Little Town of Bethlehem" spilled out into the holy night. The music, which had once felt like a taunt, now wrapped around him, familiar and strange. He slipped inside, standing in the very back, his broad shoulders pressed against the cold wall. The church was packed, warm with candlelight and the breath of the congregation. His eyes scanned the crowd and found her instantly. Juliana was seated up front with the children, helping a small shepherd adjust his costume. She wore a simple dress of deep green, and a candle held in her hand cast a soft light on her profile. She was smiling, completely absorbed in the moment, a picture of serene joy. Caleb listened as the pastor spoke. The sermon was not about tinsel and presents, but about darkness and light. It was about shepherds living in fields, keeping watch through the long, cold night, and about a star that appeared to guide them to a hope they never dared to expect. It was about a God who did not stay distant, but who entered into the cold and the darkness to bring warmth and redemption. The greatest healing, the pastor said, his voice gentle but firm, begins not when the pain is forgotten, but when we finally allow a new light to enter the places we have kept so carefully dark. Each word seemed aimed directly at Caleb's soul. He looked at his own hands, calloused and strong, hands that had built walls. He thought of the empty chair by his fireplace, the silent rooms of his house. He thought of the deliberate years-long winter he had chosen to live in. And then he looked at Juliana, a living symbol of the light and warmth and second chances the pastor described. The conflict within him, which had raged for weeks, quieted into a single clear ache. After the final hymn, as the congregation began to file out, laughing and wishing each other Merry Christmas, Caleb remained frozen at the back. Juliana, herding her flock of costumed children toward their parents, saw him. Her expression shifted from surprise to a deep, understanding tenderness. She spoke softly to Miles, who nodded, and then she made her way through the thinning crowd toward him. They met in the shadow of the church porch, the snowy yard before them glittering under a sky now brilliant with stars. The sounds of departing families faded, leaving them in a bubble of quiet. "You came," she said simply. Caleb looked down at her, the candlelight from the church windows dancing in her eyes. I heard what the pastor said." His voice was low, gravelly with emotion. "About letting light into the dark places." He took a deep, shaky breath, the cold air sharp in his lungs. "You were right, Juliana. I have been hiding. From people. From Christmas. From God. I thought he took everything from me. So I shut the door." He reached out, a hesitant, monumental gesture, and his bare, work-roughened fingers brushed against the wool of her cloak where her hand rested. The touch was electric, a spicy, thrilling connection that burned through the layers of fabric in time and sorrow. She did not pull away. "Maybe," she whispered, her breath a soft cloud between them, "he didn't take it away. Maybe he was just waiting for you to be ready to receive something new. Something different but just as precious." Caleb's throat was tight. The wall was gone, crumbled not with a crash, but with the quiet, persistent warmth of her kindness and the undeniable truth of the night's message. "That night with Miles," he said, his fingers now gently closing over hers. "You said I was the man God made me to be. I haven't felt like that man in a very long time. But I think I'd like to try to find him again." A single happy tear traced a path down Juliana's cheek, catching the starlight. "Then let's look for him together," she said, her hand turning to clasp his firmly. "Starting tonight." Standing there on the church porch, under the infinite Christmas sky, the lonesome rancher did not feel lonesome anymore. The icy fortress of his heart lay open, and for the first time in a decade, he allowed the hopeful, gentle light of the Christmas star to flood in. It was a beginning, fragile and glorious, forged in a blizzard and consecrated under a sky full of promise. The winter that had once seemed endless to Caleb Mitchell began, for the first time, to feel like a season with a purpose. The deep snows were no longer just a barrier, but a beautiful blanket under which the earth rested, gathering strength for spring. And in the quiet of that resting time, something tender and strong took root between the rancher and the schoolteacher. Their courtship was not like the whirlwind romances of storybooks. It was a deliberate, gentle rebuilding, conducted with a respect for propriety and the watchful, approving eyes of Pine River. They were never alone behind closed doors. Their time together was spent in the open world, or with the solid, comforting presence of a chaperone, often Miles, who had appointed himself Juliana's steadfast guardian, or the kindly pastor's wife who would sit knitting by the parlor fire. Caleb became a student of Juliana's world. In the crisp afternoons after school, he would arrive at the schoolyard on his great gentle draft horse, a second, quieter mare in tow. He taught Juliana to ride, his large hands careful and steady as he adjusted her grip on the reins, his instructions low and patient. The spicy thrill of those moments came not from impropriety, but from the sheer, breathtaking nearness of him, from the solid feel of his hands guiding hers, from the way his gray eyes would crinkle at the corners when she mastered a new skill. They rode through snowy meadows and along the frosted riverbank, their conversations weaving from the habits of winter birds to the dreams they had once, long ago, tucked away. In return, Juliana brought her world into his home, but always with the door left open to propriety. She would come for supper, bringing a pie or a pot of stew, accompanied by Mrs. Alder, the pastor's wife. After the meal, while Mrs. Alder dozed contentedly in the rocking chair, Juliana would read aloud by the firelight. She read poetry that spoke of hope, and passages from the Bible about renewal, her voice a soft melody in the once silent cabin. Caleb would sit in his chair, mending a harness or simply watching her, the words washing over him, healing places in his soul he had thought were scarred forever. The spicy tension simmered in the glances they shared when Mrs. Alder's eyes were closed, in the brush of his hand against hers as he passed her a cup of tea, in the unspoken language that grew richer every day. As the snows melted and the first brave green shoots appeared in the muddy earth, Caleb's faith, once a forgotten ember, kindled into a quiet, steady flame. He began attending Sunday services regularly, no longer a shadow at the back, but sitting beside Juliana, his deep voice a new resonant thread in the hymns. He saw the hand of a purposeful God not in his past pain, but in the path that had led Juliana to his door, in the second chance that was unfolding with every sunrise. He started praying again, not with angry demands, but with grateful whispers, thanking God for the thaw in his heart. One bright, clear day in late spring, when the wildflowers were dotting the meadows and the river ran high and swift with snowmelt, Caleb knew the time had come. He had a plan, but it required an ally. He sought out Miles, finding the boy fishing off the same bridge where he'd once shouted at carolers. Caleb knelt, speaking to him man to man, asking for his help with a very important surprise for Miss Juliana. Miles's solemn face broke into a grin of utmost importance. The following Saturday, Juliana was told by a breathless Miles that there was a baby fox den near the river bend and she simply had to see it. Intrigued, she let him lead her down the now familiar path. But instead of fox kits, she found the riverbank transformed. A simple quilt was laid out in a sunny spot, and a small basket held strawberries and fresh bread. And there, standing tall and nervous, was Caleb, wearing his best shirt, his hat in his hands. Miles, his duty done, gave a little wave and scampered back toward town, leaving them in the dappled sunlight by the singing water. It was the same river, Juliana realized with a catch in her throat, where he had first driven her away with his anger. "Juliana," Caleb began, his voice thick. He reached for her hands, holding them in his own, his thumbs tracing gentle circles over her knuckles. "I've brought you back to the place where I was my worst, because I need you to see how far that broken man has come, because of you." He led her to the quilt and they sat, not touching but so close she could feel the warmth of him. "You saw the man I was, angry, lost, living in a tomb of my own making. You didn't turn away. You braved my storm. You showed me a God who doesn't abandon us in our winters, but sends the spring." He took a deep breath, his gaze locked on hers, full of a vulnerable, powerful love. "You didn't just teach my heart to feel, Juliana. You taught it to hope. You taught it to love again." He then stood and walked to the base of a young aspen tree. From behind its slender trunk, he retrieved a small carved wooden box. Returning to kneel before her on one knee, he opened it. Inside, resting on a bed of velvet, was a simple, beautiful ring, a band of polished gold set with a single small pearl that gleamed with a soft, moonlit radiance. "This was my mother's," he said, his eyes glistening. "It's not fancy, but it's a symbol of a love that lasted a lifetime. Juliana Rhodes, would you do me the extraordinary honor of allowing me to spend my lifetime loving you? Will you marry me?" The world seemed to hold its breath, the river's murmur, the whisper of the aspens, the distant call of a meadowlark. Joy, pure and radiant, exploded within Juliana. It was the answer to her quietest prayers, the fulfillment of a faith that had seen light in the deepest dark. Tears of happiness streamed down her face as she nodded, her voice choked with emotion. "Yes, Caleb. Oh yes. 1,000 times yes." He slipped the ring onto her finger, the fit perfect as if it had always been meant to be there. Then he rose and drew her into his arms. Their first true kiss, there by the river of his redemption, was not a spicy stolen touch, but a solemn, searing promise. It was a kiss of healing, of gratitude, of a future openly chosen and joyfully welcomed. It spoke of a love forged in faith and patience, a love that had waited for God's perfect timing. Their wedding, held in the little white church at the height of summer, was a celebration for the entire town of Pine River. Sunlight streamed through the windows and wildflowers decorated every pew. Miles, beaming with pride, carried the rings on a pillow. Caleb, standing before the altar, looked not like the lonesome rancher, but like a man who had found his way home. When Juliana walked down the aisle on the arm of the pastor, her simple dress the color of cream, her eyes only for Caleb, there was not a dry eye in the house. They exchanged vows they had written themselves, speaking of second chances, of faith restored, and of love as enduring as the mountains. When the pastor pronounced them man and wife, and Caleb kissed his bride, a cheer went up that shook the rafters. The Lonesome Ranch was lonesome no more. It was a home, blessed and new, a testament to a promise made by a river and sealed before God and their community, a promise of forever. The passage of time at Star Creek Ranch was no longer marked by the slow, grinding turn of seasons endured, but by the sweet, swift rhythm of seasons lived. 1 year after that first fragile Christmas when Juliana had knocked on his door, Caleb Mitchell's world was a symphony of sound and warmth. The log house, once a silent monument to grief, now echoed with the crackle of a perpetual fire, the murmur of shared prayer before meals, and the soft, joyous sound of Juliana's laughter. Garlands of dried wildflowers and pine cones hung where there had been only bare walls, and in the window, a single bright red candle burned each evening, a signal not of loneliness, but of a welcome light in the darkness for any traveler who might pass by. The winter outside was fierce, but inside, a profound and lasting summer had taken root in their hearts. Their first months of marriage were a gentle, spicy discovery of shared life. Caleb learned the rhythm of Juliana's days, the way she hummed when she baked, the careful way she mended his work shirts, the scent of lavender that clung to her skin. Juliana learned the language of her husband's care, the way he would bank the fire before she woke, the silent cup of tea he'd place beside her as she read, the protective, loving weight of his arm around her shoulders as they sat together in the evenings. Their love, built on a foundation of faith and patience, now blossomed with the quiet, burning passion of a commitment sanctified and secure. Every touch, every glance held the spicy thrill of a promise rightfully fulfilled, a private fire that warmed them from within against the cold. As autumn's gold faded to winter's white, a new and wondrous secret began to grow. Juliana shared the news with Caleb on a quiet evening, her hand placed gently over her own. The joy that illuminated his face was brighter than any Christmas star. The man who had once believed his story of fatherhood was forever closed, now knelt beside his wife, his large, calloused hand resting with trembling awe over hers, his whispered prayers of thanks mixing with tears of humble joy. This child was not a replacement for the loss he had known, it was a brand new chapter, a miracle he had never dared to pray for, a testament to the abundant, restorative grace he now believed in with all his soul. The pregnancy became the center of their shared world. Caleb was a picture of tender, fiercely protective love. He fussed over Juliana, ensuring she never lifted anything heavy, wrapping her in the warmest blankets, his ears attuned to her every need. He built a sturdy cradle from seasoned oak, sanding it until it was silken smooth, each stroke of his hand a prayer for the tiny life to come. Juliana, in turn, glowed with a serene happiness, her faith deepening as she felt the new life stir within her. She would read aloud from the Psalms, her voice soft and sure, and Caleb would listen, his hand resting on her rounded belly, feeling the miracle of a kick, a promise of the future. Christmas Eve arrived again, cloaking Pine River in a deep, holy silence. The town's celebrations had wound down, and a perfect, heavy snow began to fall, muffling the world in soft white. Inside the ranch house, however, a different kind of anticipation filled the air. Juliana had felt the first sure signs that their child was ready to make its entrance. Caleb, his heart pounding with a potent mix of fear and exhilaration, had ridden swiftly to fetch the midwife and the pastor's wife, who now moved about the bedroom with calm, capable efficiency. Caleb was banished to the main room, but he refused to sit. He paced before the fire, each muffled sound from the other room pulling him taut as a wire. He prayed without ceasing, not the angry, bargaining prayers of his past, but prayers of trust and surrender. He thought of the shepherd boy, Miles, lost in a storm, and how finding him had been the first step toward finding himself. He thought of the Christmas star that had led him to a church porch and to a truth he could no longer deny. This night, he understood, was the culmination of that journey, not an end but the most beautiful beginning. After hours that felt both like moments and lifetimes, a new, strong, indignant cry pierced the quiet of the house. It was a sound of pure, vibrant life. The bedroom door opened and the midwife, smiling wearily, beckoned him in. Juliana lay propped on pillows, her face pale but radiant, ethereal in the lamplight. In her arms, swaddled tightly in a soft, white blanket, was their son. Caleb approached as one would approach a sacred altar, his boots silent on the floorboards. He sank to his knees beside the bed, his eyes overflowing. Gently, Juliana placed the precious bundle into his arms. The weight of his son was the greatest weight and the greatest lightness Caleb had ever known. He looked down at the tiny, perfect face, the dark lashes, the small mouth. This was his boy. A gift forged from forgiveness, from faith, from a love that had dared to hope again. The old, frozen pain that had lived in a hollowed-out chamber of his heart for a decade did not vanish, but it was finally, completely, surrounded and overcome by this immense, healing joy. He wept openly, tears of release and gratitude splashing onto the clean wool of the blanket. "Daniel," Juliana whispered softly, her hand reaching to stroke Caleb's bowed head. "For the prophet who was faithful in the lion's den. For God is our judge and he has brought us justice and joy." Caleb looked from his son's face to his wife's. "Daniel," he repeated, the name a prayer on his lips. He leaned over, kissing Juliana with all the tenderness and passion of a man who has been given back his soul. Then he kissed his son's forehead. Later, with the fire rebuilt and the world outside their window a silent, snow-blanketed wonder, Caleb sat in his chair by the hearth. Juliana dozed nearby, and baby Daniel slept contentedly in the curve of his father's arm. Miles, who had been fetched to meet the new arrival, slept on a pallet at their feet, a part of the family in every way that mattered. Caleb looked around his home, now full to the brim with love and life and the gentle breath of sleep. He saw the journey in its entirety, from the frozen, angry man shouting at kindness on his porch, to the man who now cradled his greatest gift. The path had been cleared by a woman's courage, a child's plight, and a faith that had stubbornly refused to let the light go out. His forever after was not a destination, but this warm, breathing moment, and every one that would follow, held safe in the arms of love and the promise of God's endless grace. The lonesome rancher was gone forever, replaced by a husband, a father, a man whose heart had not only learned to feel again, but to love without measure. If this story of a heart thawed by faith and love reminded you of the magic of second chances, consider joining our community. Subscribe for more tales where light finds its way through the coldest winters, and where love, always patient and kind, wins in the end.